Hello, my topic is Fundamentalist Christians and Jews. Fundamentalist premillennialists believe that the millennium, or 1,000 years of righteousness, could only begin with the physical arrival of Jesus. As people who held to a literal interpretation of the Bible, they offered a distinct understanding of world events. At center stage of their prophetic teaching were the Jews. After the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British government stated their support for a national home for the Jewish people in the Middle East, there was a rise of fundamentalist literature declaring that sometime soon the Jews would reestablish their nation. There was chaos in the world as the Germans were still a threat in 1917. But premillennialists understood that history was leading somewhere. In American premillennial thinking, there was a significant sympathy for the Jewish people. But America also witnessed considerable anti-Semitism. In the 1920s, for example, Henry Ford supported the view that the Jews were behind a master conspiracy to control the world. His newspaper, Dearborn Independent, used the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as a source to promote anti-Semitism. In his study of the American Protestant press and the persecution of Jews by the National Socialists, also known as the Nazis, Robert Ross claims that fundamentalists who were supportive of Jews had no feeling for the Jews as persons. Fundamentalists only saw the Jews as a, quote, category or cohort called the chosen people. Concerning fundamentalist press coverage of the Jews, Ross writes, quote, references to the actual persecution of real people in Germany were included by some fundamentalist writers only to make the larger point that God was at work in the world in order that prophetic statements made in the scriptures as interpreted by these writers could at last be fulfilled. End of quote. For example, in 1933, A.C. Sneed in the Alliance Weekly wrote, quote, the Jews are to return in Palestine in unbelief. And it may be that God is using the hatred of the Nazis against the Jews as a scourge to drive them in large numbers into Palestine. End of quote. Ross argues that fundamentalist focus on the Jews as a chosen people prevents them from caring about the Jews in a more personal manner. He suggests that prophecy writers and believers practice a particular brand of anti-Semitism. Is he correct? There were many fundamentalists who embraced a prophetic analysis of Jewish persecution. Louis S. Ballman, pastor of the First Brethren Church of Long Beach, California, was one of the many prolific prophecy writers in the 1930s. He wrote for the Brethren Evangelist, the King's Business, and the Sunday School Times. Bowman provided much more detail and actual reporting of Jewish persecution during Hitler's reign than was the case of any liberal Protestant writer. Bowman wrote numerous articles and editorials. In one example, responding to a Hitler speech that spoke of a, quote, Jewish world coalition, Bowman wrote, quote, now, if there is any such thing as a Jewish world coalition, will someone please tell us where its headquarters are? Who is the head? Wherein has its power? Millions of agonizing, dying Jews would like to know where they can go for a bit of help. End of quote. Well, the sarcasm here drives home the point about how much nonsense this was, the notion of a Jewish world coalition. Fundamentalist publications publish paid advertisements about the persecution of the Jews. The title of one full page advertisement in the Moody Monthly Institute was, quote, shout it from the housetops. It's time to help the Jews. Another primary source is the Fundamentalist Periodical, Our Hope, a journal that operated from 1894 to 1957, and it did so without any advertisements. Its many statements on the topics of Jews sheds light on the position that premillennial dispensationalists had for the Jewish people. In 1930, 3 years before the rise of Adolf Hitler, before he became dictator in 1933, Our Hope wrote, quote, Adolf Hitler, will he be Germany's dictator? He is the outspoken enemy of the Jews, one of the most fanatical anti-Semites of Europe. End of quote. Our Hope, again, writing about this 3 years before Hitler took power. Repressive measures began soon after Hitler gained power. Viewing them as, quote, vermin, the National Socialists sought to drive the Jews out of Germany. In early 1933, the liberal Christian Century reported the appointment of Hitler as chancellor, but did not mention any persecution of Jews. Whereas editor of Our Hope, Arno Gabelin, spoke very clearly about the tragedy of the National Socialists, of the Nazis. He actually even traveled to Germany. He did so in 1937 to gain a first-hand view of Nazi treatment of the Jews. And so soon, readers received reports of National Socialist persecution of Jews. For this period, many people would later claim they were unaware of the extent of Nazi crimes against the Jews. But the fundamentalists were writing about it, if anyone was paying attention. In 1938, the Fundamentalist Journal, again referring to Our Hope, reported that, quote, after Hitler and his minions took over Austria, even converted Jews were not safe from the Nazi wrath. Also, Our Hope wrote, this is worse than inhuman. It is a diabolic cruelty. But there is a day of reckoning. There's a day of reckoning coming. God will deal with the enemies of his peoples. And when judgment comes, as it surely will, this modern anti-Semitism will find its ignominious end. Now, Here we again have strong statements from Our Hope, and they didn't pull any punches when they talk about the cruelty of the Nazis. The acts of the German government continued to appall Our Hope. It gave grim reports of the attacks against Jewish professionals, Kristallnacht, and other vicious acts. Of course, the reports became grimmer when war broke out and Nazi control expanded throughout Europe. In October 1942, for example, Arno Gabelin declared, quote, "Not gradually, but suddenly, Monster Hitler developed a devilish mania to persecute and exterminate the entire Jewish race, an ambition which he has pushed more and more to the front, and in which he persists today as never before in his bloody and despicable career." End of quote. This is 1942. Our Hope published a chart stating that the National Socialists murdered 2 million Jews and another 5 million were in danger of extermination. Gabelin told his readers that, quote, "Hitler's master, Satan, is after all a stupid fellow, and that the Nazis would make blunders that would lead to their downfall." End of quote. Again, just to put a date on this, Arno Gabelin, this is 1942. He's presented that 2 million Jews have been murdered and 5 are in jeopardy. Gabelin's reports of the war ghetto and the massacre of countless Jews were shocking emotional accounts. Accounts of German defeats in 1944 and 1945 proved to Our Hope writers, quote, "that those who persecute the Jewish people will be cursed by God." End of quote. Additional news of the horrid details of the concentration and extermination camps caused the Fundamentalist Journal to raise the issue of evolution. Quote, "We wonder what the evolutionists and others think who have seen the world getting better and better all the time. And what of the theologians who maintain that man will work himself into a millennium of peace and righteousness? They must have a hard time convincing themselves after reading about and seeing the pictures of the wholesale atrocities perpetrated in German prison camps." And then he goes on. "These organized murders and sadistic maltreatments were not the work of one man or one group of men. They were devised and carried out by thousands of Nazi beasts, the product of modern Germany." End of quote. Well, here again was the fundamentalist linking of German savagery to modern liberal ideas that sprung out of Germany. One can see this in fundamentalist literature going back decades, making reference to German higher criticism. The scholars, the theologians of the later on in the 19th century, who were basically just tearing the Bible apart and reducing it to this understanding that it was so much of it was, a myth and not to be taken seriously, not to be, at least certainly not to be read literally, not to be seen as, God's word. The excuse me. According to one historian, quote, the premillennial eschatology of the Fundamentalist Journal led it to accept the future restoration to Palestine of Jewish people unequivocally, and to believe the reported extermination of Jews in Europe when liberal Protestantism could not. End of quote. Another scholar found it shocking that the liberal journal Christian Century would not believe the daily news reports about Hitler's brutality towards the Jewish people. End of quote. Some historians argue that fundamentalists failed to disentangle themselves from anti-Semitism. However, it is possible that most of the confusion concerning the fundamentalist position on the Jews is a result of two issues. First, although they represented a tiny minority, and there was really only a handful of them, there were some loud fundamentalists such as William Bell Riley and Gerald Winrod, who did indeed voice anti-Semitic views. Second, it was not easy to make the distinction that Jews were God's chosen people and that many unbelieving Jews were going to perish during the Great Tribulation. And this gets back to the premillennial / dispensationalist prophetic view that there would be this short period of a great tribulation where many humans would be lost, including Jews, and readers who were unaware of the nuances or didn't quite understand what the fundamentals were saying could easily jump to the conclusion that fundamentalists were in essence promoting or had a very benign view of the fact that Jews were going to perish. So, in other words, premillennial preaching of prophecy that spoke of end times horror for non-believing Jews certainly sounded like anti-Semitism to those not understanding the nuances of prophetic teaching. All Jews could accept salvation of Christ, but biblical prophecy said that only a remnant would do so. All in all, there were fundamentalists who were too susceptible to conspiracy theories if they appeared to correlate with what they believe Bible prophecy. But a sympathetic reading is that fundamentalists tended to sort out the problem and quickly proclaim their love and support for the Jewish people. Overall, fundamentalism's record concerning Jews is clearly a favorable one, especially when you compare it to almost all other groups who address the issue. And scholars have gone back and looked at the fundamentalist literature, and they've compared it to the liberal Protestant literature, looking how both of those groups were assessing what was happening in Germany. Anyway, we see the fundamentalist record's pretty clear on this, but it becomes even more obvious with the rebirth of Israel. So I'm going to turn to the what took place in the Middle East. By the end of World War II, the British were unable to solve the Palestinian conflict between Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs. The British had a mandate since the early 1920s, and they controlled Palestine, and there was increasing tension between the Jews living in Palestine and the Arabs. Now, at this stage, everyone's a Palestinian. You got Palestinian Jews, you got Palestinian Arabs. The United Nations tackled the problem because the British mandate was winding down. The first step was the appointment of 11 members of the official UN body to decide the outcome of Palestine. The United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, the acronym is UNISCOP, began with the basic outline that Palestine was to be divided between the Jews and the Arabs. In a 9-month period in 1947, UNISCOP, UNSCOP, visited the Jewish refugee camps in Europe. They met with Jews and Arabs in Palestine, and they gathered all this information and they debated the issue. So the UNSCOP presented its recommendations to the UN General Assembly on November 29, 1947. The majority report stipulated the partition of Palestine into 2 states, with the Jewish state having most of the coastal area, Western Galilee, and the Negev. The 2 states were also to have an economic union. Only after strong American Jewish lobbying and a powerful speech by the Russian ambassador did the Americans and Russians see the necessary 2/3 majority in the assembly for a petition. So we kind of look at this as, the world parliament, if we want to use that term, had decided the Jews would have their own state, as would the Arabs. Now, immediately, a widespread civil war broke out that caused the UN and Washington to waver on their support for the partition plan. But on May 14th, 1948, the day before the British mandate officially ended, the Jews proclaimed their independent state, which they called Israel. Now, as a result of the support of President Harry Truman, the White House issued a statement recognizing Israel almost immediately after the new state came into being. The events leading up to the creation of Israel generated much emotion for fundamentalists as they interpreted political events through the lens of prophecy belief. When Palestine experienced widespread civil war and chaos that caused apprehension in the United States and Washington, one premillennialist proclaimed, and this was in late 1947, that the Jews will eventually be given not a portion Palestine, but the whole of the land, and ultimately the whole of the Transjordan as well. With the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, fundamentalists wrote even more enthusiastically on biblical prophecy and the Middle East. The fundamentalist Moody Monthly wrote of Jewish strength in Palestine, heroically gaining what people will only give in fulfillment of his promise. End of quote. Some fundamentalists voiced the rebirth of Israel was, quote, the most significant event since Jesus Christ was born. Stating that it would be a blessing, the American Holiness Journal, and this was another fundamentalist publication, encouraged readers to follow newspapers and keep a scrapbook of the, quote, marvelous prophecy of Israel. Contrast to the buoyant news, Moody Monthly made reference to the Islamic imperialism and its fervent religious totalitarianism. In one sense, the creation of the State of Israel was a momentous event that gave fundamentalists a boost after years of being shamed in the culture battles of the 1940s, after being eclipsed by liberal Protestantism in serious debates, and also being ignored by the mainstream media. Perhaps fundamentalists could be in a better position to be more visible and effective in winning souls for Christ. Premillennialist John F. Walvoord of Dallas Seminary wrote in 1949 that the previous 25 years witnessed a revolution in eschatology, with even liberal theologians giving it more attention. Offering clarity on developments in 1948, premillennialists could claim that they had been closer to truth all along, writing on the National Gathering of the Jews. Radio Bible teacher M.R. DeHaan declared, quote, all history stands as proof of the literal fulfillment of the Word of God, end quote. In the end, had prophecy believers not been wiser to oppose accommodation with an increasingly secular society that was blind to God's divine plan? After the creation of the state in Israel, it appeared ordinary fundamentalists that they might be actually one step ahead of Washington policymakers, the so-called wise men, and the so-called best and brightest who represented the powerful American establishment. Excuse me. In late 1956, when the British, French, and Israelis successfully carried out a complicated military operation against Egypt that resulted in their taking control of the Suez Canal from the Egyptians, President Dwight Eisenhower responded with anger. The Eisenhower administration believed that the action taken by the British, French, and the Israelis was unacceptable from every geopolitical angle. Applying economic pressure, the United States forced the British and the French to withdraw from Egypt and the Israelis from the Gaza Strip and from the Sinai too. It was important for the Eisenhower administration to maintain stability in the Middle East by what they believed was the Americans believe in it was important by limiting revolutionary change and thus keeping the Soviets away. On the other hand, the sole focus of the premillennialists was Israel. Their support for the Israeli attack on Egypt was high, and so was their criticism of American politicians. T.B. Davis asked, quote, "Is the oil of the Middle East more important than the blessing of God?" End of quote. And this gets back to, the Old Testament, getting back to Genesis, and that the point that if one blessings, one must be supportive of the chosen people. One must side with the Jews. Those who do not side with the Jews are asking for problems. Okay, so this is what TB is referring to when he talks about the blessing of God. In their biblical understanding, God's blessing went to those who blessed the Jewish people, who blessed Israel, and curses to those who cursed Israel. Now, soon after the Suez War, Wilbur M. Smith wrote of the prosperity and plenty that Israel witnessed in its first 8 years and the greatest glory yet to untold. And for these fundamentalists, they would just take a look at how Israel was faring. In this case, reflecting back in the last 8 years. How was Israel faring since 1948? Well, Israel still had to deal with its hostile neighbors. But when we think of the social conditions, the economic conditions, Israel, this tiny democracy, was doing actually quite well in the Middle East with this redevelopment and with this building projects and with this reclaiming the desert with irrigation and with this focus on education and learning and technology. It wasn't doing too bad. Using hard-hitting language, Wilbur Smith wrote, quote, "Anyone who saw the pitiful barrenness and poverty of that land even 30 years ago and has seen the land more recently recognizes that the Arab was a curse to the land." End of quote. Pretty harsh language, but Wilbur Smith is again pointing to what he has seen has happened in recent years compared to the poverty of that part of the world. William K. Harrison, another premillennialist, judged that Israeli progress was, quote, "one of the most amazing stories of our times." He wrote in 1959 that it is practically certain that the Jews will seize the opportunity to take all of Jerusalem and straighten out their frontier along the Jordan River. End of quote. As for U.S.-Israel relations, premillennialists received no proof from Eisenhower, who had been raised in the Fundamentalist River Brethren Church, of having any sympathy for Israel's favorite place in Bible prophecy. Beyond his focus on world Cold War politics, it is possible that his parents' conversion to the Jehovah's Witnesses a sect that focused on end time teachings caused Eisenhower to respond disdainfully to any notions of Bible prophecy and religious zeal. And so this has been one position that's been put out there by a few historians, that the fact that his parents became part of the Jehovah Witness cult, that this had made him very sensitive to any kind of interpretation that brings in the Bible prophecy relating to the Middle East. Of course, one cannot know for certain what was the motivation for his position. I mean, outside of the most obvious ones of the geopolitical advantages of keeping peace in the Middle East. Liberal Protestants embrace replacement theology, and that was the doctrine which declares that the Old Testament had been superseded by the New Testament, and the Christian church had now been replaced as God's chosen people. Now, the fundamentalists thought otherwise, and they wrote in their journals and preached in their churches, what they preached and what they wrote gave ample evidence of their love and support for Israel. There was the one key verse from the Bible, and that was Genesis 12:3. And much I would argue that much of the evangelical fundamentalist support for Israel is that verse really says it all. Much of it is as a result of that verse. Fundamentalists, observing the Arab-Israeli conflict, saw oppositional spiritual forces in play, and also they viewed Israel as compelling evidence of the sovereignty of the Lord of history. I mean, before 1948, it was the fundamentalists that kept referring to prophecy that there would be a rebirth of Israel. The Jews would once again have a national home in the Middle East, whereas others were skeptical about that possibility. Was not God's promise to Abraham of a great nation written in the Old Testament realized? Many Christians marveled on how God used Israel to make known his plans for the world. As one Christian writer pointed out, quote, almost all the writers of the Bible were Jews. 3/4 of the Bible is Old Testament. And 95% of the Old Testament is about Israel. Kind of butchered that quote, so let me just start all over again. 3/4 of the Bible is Old Testament, and 95% of the Old Testament is about Israel. The writer goes on. The Messiah was God incarnate in Jewish flesh. Israel is the instrument through whom God has revealed and carried out his saving purpose. End of quote. So fundamentalists were absolutely certain that Jews would continue to play a vital role in God's plan.